We're starting the second part of speech perception, and we have really just gone through the phonemes, and I hope you did create some of those with your mouths, with your articulators, the a, e, t, bat, l, and how that kind of feels in your mouth, and then going through those allophones that I think is really interesting, and how we have these different dialects, these different sounds that we can make between kitten, 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 depending on where you're from, and how that leads into this idea of the lack of invariability. So the context is really changing from D to do, D to do. You notice that the D sound, it really wasn't the same relationship between those formant transitions, or the same formant transitions themselves at all, and yet we're still hearing that as a D before the vowel, whether it was E or U. And you might also notice in this that there's going to be some sound changes, as a lot of this now is from last spring, and I'm splicing in new pieces from this fall and just trying to keep what I can. And not only was I more energetic and not as tired, as I'm going into town 3 days a week now, and I feel like there's a lot more to do to keep up with things, but there's just a change in my laptops, and so I'll apologize for there's going to be some differences in sound here, and you might have to turn things up and down just a little bit. This picture comes from Lieberman in 1957, and what he's showing here is the word bag, and if you remember back to that speech spectrogram of the word had, most of what you could see there was the ah sound. And what this is showing is how the b sound before bag is influencing our articulation of the ah, all along where we see those diagonal lines. And the g, making the g from bag, is influencing how we're producing the ah sound, all the way where we see those diagonal dotted lines. So bag, we're going to produce that ah sound very differently than when we're saying something like had, and yet perceptually we hear it as ah sound. I have had one textbook along the way that has described this as, it's not like you're putting beads on a necklace or on a chain when we're chaining together these different allophones, these different sounds that we're making. It's a lot more like pouring Jello. It mixes together. Now, the fact that we perceive the sound of a phoneme as the same, even though the acoustic signal is changing a great deal because of context and because of this coarticulation, this is an example of a perceptual constancy. I will talk about this a bit more in the next slideshow, as we will talk about categorical perception. So we have this continuous signal where we have a coarticulation of sounds, and yet this isn't difficult for us. And if we look at, so here I have put together, actually I stole all of this from Dr. Robin Morris when she used to teach this class. I'm pretty sure I took this from her. We have this, if we did this with writing, and I have this sentence here, I usually have 1 or 2 students in the class who can tell me what this sentence says. I'm not going to give you the answer to this. I'll give you the answer in the next slideshow, as if you're not guessing at it and I give you the answer, it's really no fun. But if we look at the silence that is between the words, if we look at the speech spectrogram, this is less than 40% of the silence that we experience. We experience more silence in the middle of words where there are these 2 voiceless stops close together, or where there is a voiceless stop in the middle of the word, like aperture would have some silences within it. But as I'm sitting here speaking, there's not very much silence in between the words. They really just all mush together. We would not handle this with reading very well at all. One of the studies that has looked at this, some of the researchers that were curious about this are Pollock and Pickett back in 1964, where they did a study called the "What Are You Doing?" study. At least that's what I call it. I can't remember if that's what it's actually called. But if you notice, we don't usually say, "What are you doing?" And that's the speech spectrogram up in A, is somebody, not me, saying, "What are you doing?" with the breaks between the words and clearly saying each word. Usually what we say is something like, "What you doing? What are you doing?" Like that. So what they did was they had people come in and they recorded them speaking to, I think they had a Confederate in there. They had them speaking to someone while they were supposedly waiting to go in for an experiment. And then when they came in for the experiment, they were asked to identify words that were spliced out from their own speech. Okay, as they were having this conversation with somebody else, they would pick out a single word, and people were at an accuracy of less than 50% for words pulled out of their own speech. So really, the sounds are influenced by the context and the coarticulation, but we are using context in order to perceive the sounds well enough to understand speech. Okay, so there's not just variability in the speech stream because of context and coarticulation. We also have a great deal of variability from different speakers and even within speakers. So within speakers, I can be really happy when I say a sentence, or I can be really unhappy when I say a sentence. And those sentences were pretty similar with really different emotion. And we might even have some tears in there or whatever, where it's getting a little bit broken up. And with that emotion, we are still perceiving the phonemes as the phonemes in the speech stream mostly correctly. Fatigue, when we get tired, we might tend to mumble a little bit and slur a little bit. As long as that's not a great deal of mumbling and slurring, people still understand us. We can even talk with gum in our mouths and people understand us just fine. I usually give the example here of when I used to brush my teeth, and I was deciding with my nephew and niece which show we were going to watch next or what game we were going to watch next. And they couldn't understand everything I said with a toothbrush in my mouth, but they did a pretty good job of understanding me, even with a toothbrush in my mouth. We have even more variability between speakers. If we look at different people with different dialects, we all sound really different from each other, and yet we tend to understand each other. If you've moved around or gone to different places or listened to different speakers quite a bit, you might see that there are some words, there are some structures that it takes you a little while maybe to interpret or a little while to get used to, but we understand people with wildly different dialects. As we talked about allophones in the last lecture, these allophones change a great deal. And I mentioned British speakers having the bottle, and I think I did, and butter, that they have that glottal stop in the middle of where we have a flap with bottle and butter. They have a glottal stop, but we understand them, they understand us. We also speak at different rates. Some people speak relatively slowly, and some people talk much more quickly, and we tend to keep up with the different rates and understand people who are talking more slowly as well. And we have people speaking from different genders, and so slightly different frequencies, and yet we understand people from different genders as well, just seamlessly. It just doesn't seem any different to listen to a man as listening to a woman as far as how much we understand of what they're saying, right? So we have a limited number of categories. We have a limited number of phonemes, categories of sound, these phonemes that are formed from a really wide range of acoustic signals that vary based on within speakers, between speakers, and because of context and coarticulation. With these categories, we have phonemes have clear phonetic boundaries. This is called categorical perception, and I'm going to show an example on the next slide. Okay, so for an example of categorical perception, I'm going to use this study from Imus and Corbett, 1973. that was looking at voice onset time. So if we go back and remember when you say da, that D, right, is a voiced alveolar stop. It's voiced, and the voicing is starting at about 17 milliseconds. When you say ta, that T is a voiceless alveolar stop, and the voicing doesn't start until about 91 milliseconds as we start to get into the ah sound. So if we look at what people are perceiving, Imus and Corbett gave participants a computerized voice onset time for these sounds where they controlled and manipulated voice onset time to be at 0 milliseconds, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80. Okay, so all of those different timings of different times in milliseconds that the voicing starts. And again, this was controlled by computer. And what they found was if there was, I'm going to use this 25 millisecond change, if there was a 25 millisecond change within a category boundary, so if we look at da, if they went from 0 milliseconds to 25 milliseconds, that is still all perceived as da. And with that 25 millisecond difference, people said, these sound the same to me. Okay, and as we move out past 50 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds to 75 milliseconds, we see the same thing. Now we're in the category of ta, and even with a 25 millisecond difference, those sound the same to people. Now let's look at the 25 milliseconds that spans that categorical boundary between da and ta for us, as this phonemic difference, the difference between da and ta, is a meaningful difference in our language, but it has this particular boundary in it, so that if they looked at 25 milliseconds, let's say starting at 30 milliseconds, going to 55 milliseconds, this looks like it must be 25 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds, that 25 milliseconds, now they're saying those sound different. Okay, so again, a categorical boundary where if it's on one side of the boundary, it sounds like that phoneme. If it's on the other side of the boundary, it sounds like the other phoneme. And if it spans the boundary, it sounds different to us. And this is particularly for English. We have another language, so in Spanish, they have a different ta sound. If I remember, that boundary is different. If you want to talk to any Spanish speakers about how much we understand or don't understand when we hear or don't perceive those differences. When we are working to understand speech, we are a great deal using the context to understand speech. I'm going to show that in just a minute. Another thing, we do everything we can to understand this very complicated speech stream. And one of the things we see is an effect of visual information on speech perception. I actually started introducing this back when we were talking about music and sound and how vision and sound and hearing interact. But this great example of audio-visual speech perception, as it is called, is the McGurk effect. And a lot of you, I know, have experience with the McGurk effect because I usually have students who are pretty excited when we start talking about it, and they can tell me about it already. I give you the link in Blackboard for this video where the person is saying ba, ba, ba. Okay. You should go ahead and click on that link. Pause this here and click on that link because it's much funner to watch it than have me yammer on about it. But anyway, so he's going ba, ba, ba. And then you start to see his lips and they change to say fa, fa, fa. And you can see his teeth come to his lower lip. And he's actually, the auditory, the sound clip, he is still saying ba, 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 but we start to hear him say fa, fa, fa. So in this case, the visual information trumps the auditory information. Even though this is auditory speech stream, if we're looking at his lips, we are hearing what we are seeing instead of what the sound clip is actually playing. And you can prove it to yourself by closing your eyes as he's saying the fa, fa, fa with his lips. And when you close your eyes, you hear ba, 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 and you can open your eyes and it can go back and forth. And no matter how, even if you know that this is an illusion, you cannot not hear the illusion. So since we know that there is this audiovisual nature to speech perception and that we use visual information, we look at a speaker's face, especially if you've noticed, I know that my hearing is not that well, and especially if there's background noise, and you may have already noticed in class, if you ask a question and I'll tend to try to look at you, and I try to get as much information as I possibly can from a speaker's face. In this study by Kriegstein et al., 2005, they had participants listen to speech of familiar and unfamiliar speakers. And in both cases, the superior temporal sulcus was activated with speech perception. Oftentimes, we've talked about the perception of movement already when we've gotten to this chapter, but since I've switched things around, we have not. So let's talk about the superior temporal sulcus for a second. The superior temporal sulcus helps us to understand biological motion. It's involved with a lot of aspects of understanding other people and understanding biological motion. So I sometimes show these kind of point light walkers that we are activating the superior temporal sulcus. Every time you pass someone in the street and you look them in the eyes, you're activating the superior temporal sulcus. We look to people's mouths and their eyes and everything to understand what are they saying, what are they talking about, and so forth. And so just listening to speech activates the superior temporal sulcus, this area that's involved with biological motion. And that was for familiar or unfamiliar speakers. If we look at the fusiform face area, this area is activated when we're listening to a familiar speaker, but not when we're listening to an unfamiliar speaker. So we have talked about the fusiform face area, this area that is active when we see particular faces. So if we have some kind of image in mind for a particular speaker, that fusiform face area is active as we're kind of trying to imagine them saying it to some extent. Whereas if it's an unfamiliar speaker, there's no activation of this kind of image of a person. Even though it doesn't feel like, if you're listening to me right now, it probably doesn't feel like, oh, I'm imagining her face saying these things. But your fusiform face area is active. Another thing that helps us perceive the speech stream very much is the role of context. And I mentioned this before, but I'm going to come back to, so we're using all the information that we can to understand this very complicated speech stream. We're using visual information where we can. We're using context whenever it's available. The person who's looked into this that I know the most is Richard Warren. In 1970, came up with this really neat study, the phonemic restoration effect. And if you remember me mentioning when we were talking about segregating the auditory stream and talking about auditory continuity, that was Richard Warren as well. And he had this broadband sound that played over a tone, where the tone actually, it was the tone would go away, the broadband cough or sound would come on, and then the tone, and then the sound, cough, or broadband noise, and then the tone again. And it sounds as if the tone is playing behind that noise, even though it's silence behind the noise. He did a very similar study with speech. And if you're going to go, and I really strongly recommend that you go and click on this link. There used to be a different one where when you get to the website, there were only a couple of links to figure out and to work through. But this one, you'll want to click on the top link and work your way down and read what's between them just a little bit to put this all together of what Richard Warren's doing. And I'm going to try and do this as much as I can with the state legislatures, blah, 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 blah. I can't remember the rest, but the state legislatures is enough. It was in the middle of a sentence. And the legislatures, that sound was missing completely. Okay, they took it out and there was a silence. except that letter sound at that point was replaced with a cough, which sometimes I'm calling a broadband noise, so that's just using lots of different frequencies. But they started out with this kind of just the state legislatures. I can't do it, but this letter was replaced with a cough. The letter is missing. People hear the missing letter. It sounds as if it's in there, and they cannot correctly place the cough. And in fact, Richard Warren went around to his colleagues and people around his school and played this for them, even though they knew where the letter or where the sound was missing. They still were, I can't exactly place what's missing. I can't tell what's missing, and it sounds like it just sounds like it is there. But again, it's going to be a lot better if you go in and click through those links and you listen to the example. And this is showing the role of context, that we can even have missing data and we fill that in. And even more fun and kind of interesting is this: there was time to Ave, okay, where the asterisk is the cough sound or a broadband noise with lots of frequencies. I can't remember which all the time, but at this point, if you'll notice, there was time to Ave. This is ambiguous, and that word could be save, shave, wave, rave, and so on, right? So that is an ambiguous word. Participants heard the word wave when the remainder of the sentence had to do with saying goodbye to a departing friend. So there was time to Ave as the steamboat took off or whatever. So in this case, we are filling in the sound after the sound is actually not there. So at this point, it's ambiguous. The sound is not there. It's a cough or some broadband sound. We listen to the rest of the sentence that disambiguates, and we go back in time, and we still restore that phoneme, which to me is just incredible. Really, really neat. A study that's really different, a really different study for looking at how we use sentence context to understand what we are hearing. Miller and Isard in 1963 found that words are more intelligible when heard in grammatical sentences that make sense. Okay, so these are just some examples of their sentences, and you can see from the anomalous and the ungrammatical string that they were using the same words and counterbalancing and doing all that nice stuff. So a normal grammatical sentence example would be: gadgets simplify work around the house. An anomalous but grammatical sentence, so a sentence that is semantically anomalous and does not make sense but is grammatical, is gadgets kill passengers from the eyes. And then an ungrammatical string would look like: between gadgets, highways, passengers, the steal. And if you're going to learn about me that I really enjoy talking gibberish, and that's always a really fun sentence for me to say every semester: between gadgets, highways, passengers, the steal. So this was a shadowing study, and if you remember, we saw shadowing, an example of shadowing, earlier this semester when Mike came up, and I think he gave up, and listened to one person say something in one ear, and he was shadowing the other person, attempting to just say everything that the other person was saying while listening to someone else, in that kind of dichotic listening task. Miller and Isard start off with a simple shadowing study. They're simply listening to those sentences and shadowing them, saying them out loud. With a normal grammatical sentence, they're at 89% accuracy. They're pretty good. When it's anomalous, it semantically does not make sense, but it is grammatical. They're at 79% accuracy. And when we get down to the ungrammatical string, they've lost it. They're down at 56% accuracy now. They're really not doing very well. What's even more telling is when they had participants shadow with a high level of background noise. So there's this sound kind of going on, and they're trying to hear the sentences, and they're still doing that, just repeating exactly what the sentences say. For normal grammatical sentences, this brings the accuracy down to 63%. For anomalous, semantically, sentences that do not make sense semantically but are grammatical, They were doing very poorly at 22%. And with the ungrammatical string, again, they're way down there. And now they're down at 3% accuracy. So you can see that even if things don't make sense semantically, grammar helps us to piece things together, because 3% accuracy is terrible.